the home of free speech now on 020-3829-1234.
Well, this leaked Labour manifesto is rustling a few feathers because evidently Labour are going to pledge to renationalise the railways and the Royal Mail, spend an extra £6 billion a year on the NHS, and also, and this will please my kids and me in fact, abolish university tuition fees alongside the bedroom tax. Now, the papers are going crazy about this and they're saying, look, it's back to the 70s and how disgraceful this is, and he's a commie, he's a Marxist, he's a trot, and all the usual stuff. And I've worked in Fleet Street, and I actually think, no, it's more like back to the 70s by the newspapers. Some of these things that Corbyn is suggesting actually make sense, actually may make some people vote for them. And as we know, young Sam's already said to me this morning that he may vote Labour as a result of these policies. Let's talk to a real socialist now, Dave Nellist, who was a Labour MP for many years for Coventry, my hometown, of course, and got kicked out of the Labour Party for being a socialist. He is an old ally and friend of Jeremy Corbyn's, and he joins me now. Good morning, Dave.
Morning, John.
Now, of course, you've been working with the TUSC, and of course, you have all decided not to put up candidates this year, but to back Jeremy. But as I understand it, you're not going to stand for Labour at this point, although you have applied to join the Labour Party again. Is that correct?
That's right, and it's a major decision for us. We stood in 135 constituencies 2 years ago, making us the sixth biggest party in the country. But we're urging supporters to work all out to get rid of the Tories and to get Jeremy into number 10. I've got to say, by the way, this is not a blank cheque for Labour. A week or so ago in the local elections, we stood in 28 local authorities against local Labour, making cuts in libraries and nursery provision and youth clubs and so on. But this is a real chance of getting the socialist and socialist policies into number 10, like some of the ones you've mentioned from the leaked manifesto, and we think it's worth putting all our efforts to get rid of the Tories and to get Jeremy in there on socialist policies.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, I mean, some of these policies are going to be extremely attractive to people. I mean, Sam's just out of university with a huge debt from university. He said, well, these kind of policies appeal to me. And me as a father, as you know, with two daughters who are at university at the moment, they appeal to me as well. And I'm certainly not a socialist. So just to dismiss them would seem to me to be ridiculous. At least this is proper politics again, and we've got some clear choices.
Well, that's right. That's why we were founded 7 years ago, co-founded by Bob Crow, the late General Secretary of the Transport Union, the RMT, because 7 years ago you couldn't tell the difference between Labour and Tories. We'd had Tony Blair, and everything after Tony Blair, in terms of Ed Miliband or Gordon Brown or David Cameron, was just Tony Blair light. It was seamless between governments, and Jeremy is different. And you've mentioned some of the policies. I mean, tuition fees. £50,000 debt at the end of 3 years. How the hell can you then save up for a mortgage to get a home? And because there's not enough houses being built, the house prices have gone through the roof in Britain. So Jeremy's plan to build 200,000 new houses a year, I personally would like them all to be rented affordable and built by local councils. My town of Coventry, your town of Coventry, we've got 20,000 people on the waiting list in Coventry. We haven't had a council house built now for 35 years. So yes, these things are going to be attractive. The BBC News, by the way, when this manifesto was leaked, went to Coventry Station and then to King's Cross to ask people as they were coming out of the station what they thought about rail renationalisation. It was literally 2-1 in Coventry and 7-3 in King's Cross in favour of it. And you raised a question about the 1970s. I've got no problem at all with going back to the 1970s. The 1970s, Britain was one of the most equal countries on the planet. Last Sunday Times brought out this rich list. The top 1,000 in this country, now worth £658 billion, at a 14% rise in their wealth last year. What would happen if nurses or street cleaners or teachers put in for Actually, they should put in for a 14% rise. We're a rich country. It's about time working class people got a share of it.
And so you think these policies will be very attractive to you? And now that it's been leaked, you may as well get on and start pushing them out on the pitch, mightn't he?
Well, and when this all kicked off about 3 weeks ago, when Theresa May called the election, the Sunday Times had a poll, 23% lead for the for the Tories. The local elections, which weren't fought in Labour areas on the 4th of May, there were mainly Tory shires that were voting. The big cities like London and Coventry, Birmingham, Manchester and so on weren't voting. There was votes for mayors, but they weren't seen as really important by people. But those results showed an 11% lead for the Tories. And when they crunched the data a couple of days later, they described it as a 2.5% swing for the Tories. So this isn't a foregone conclusion. Now, in the last couple of days, in Leamington and in York, not Labour strongholds, Jeremy Corbyn turns up with about 2 hours' notice and gets literally hundreds of people coming out at lunchtime to hear him speak. Now he's out of Parliament, the prison of Parliament, and he can get these basic ideas on better wages, public ownership, free education, new houses, funding the health service and the schools properly and so on. Get them out on the streets in the big towns and cities, he can still win this election.
He's still in a difficult position, though, over the EU, isn't he? And he's still not giving a clear, definite answer. I mean, you and I spoke about this before. We know that basically he was anti-EU, like Bob Crow, the late Bob Crow, like yourself, because to protect workers' rights and to protect workers' wages, you've got to do something about the inflow of people into the country. You've got to have control over migration within a sovereign nation. So that is still his Achilles heel, because there's still a massive amount of people out there who are traditional Labour, but perhaps voted UKIP. And just like you're saying, don't write off Labour, I don't think you can totally write off UKIP either, Dave. So it would be better if he spoke about Europe and the EU, would it not?
I agree. I want to see Jeremy in number 10. I want these socialist policies to be given a proper chance. But I'd go further on some issues. I campaigned against the common market as it was in 1975 and helped to campaign against it in the referendum last year. I described it as Thatcherism on a continental scale. A lot of the privatisations of rail, post and energy started off with directives from the European Union. And they might come back on this one, but they've temporarily dropped the idea of this thing called TTIP. But if that comes back, and Trump's talking about doing a deal with the EU on trade and so on, again, opens the door to privatisation of health and schools. So on those issues, I think he needs to argue for a Brexit for working class people. And the second issue is the one that you're raising. I mean, I want to restore the right to public ownership and so on, but I also want to stop multinational companies using cross-border agency workers to undercut the workers' wages in this country. That's why it's quite good that Len McCluskey, the leader of Unite, has now come out and said if any industry wants to use migrant workers, they have to have a trade union negotiated agreement in that sector that it will not be allowed to undercut wages. Because that's the biggest fear people have, is more people coming in for jobs, more competition, more unemployment and lower wages.
And that's not a racist policy. That's just a common
it's a numbers policy. Listen, John, in Coventry, it don't matter to me if 1,000 people turn up tomorrow morning from Liverpool or Lahore or Limerick or Latvia. If they come at £3 an hour less than the lads on the building sites are getting, it undercuts wages. When in the 70s we used to have proper control of factories with trade union closed shops, we said, doesn't matter what colour your skin is, doesn't matter who you are and so on, if you come into this factory, you come in on the same wages as everybody else, the same terms and conditions, and we controlled it in the factories. And we need the same control now when it's larger scale movement of workers, not just from one town to another, from one country to another.
You sure you're not looking back with rose-tinted spectacles when you talk about renationalisation of the railways? They weren't brilliant then, were they, Dave? Why should they be great again just because they go back into...
It does depend how you nationalise things. The history of nationalisation is fraught since the Second World onwards by making it publicly owned and publicly financed, but then putting the gaffers in charge that have run the industries down in the past. My form of nationalisation is that the people who work on the railways, the people who use the railways, and then the elected representatives of people through governments, what have you, that should be the sources that you draw from when you put boards together to run these things. Same with the health service. If it was properly renationalised, there should be a role for doctors and nurses to have a say in how it's run, not PFI companies. In Coventry, we've got a PFI hospital where they charge so much for parking your car when you go to visit a sick relative. The PFI company is making £3 million a year profit out of people parking the cars. The sort of nationalisation we want is to get rid of that, but put ordinary working people in charge again.
Not only that, but that hospital in Coventry you're talking about, my mother-in-law, she has to set off an hour before she needs to be there to find a bloody parking space as well. It's an absolute disgrace.
What we ought to have in Coventry...
Before you leave... Go on, sorry.
I was just going to say, what we ought to have in Coventry is free transport to the hospitals. If we had proper bus services that were free, we wouldn't have so many people needing to take their cars up there, and that would take the heat out of it.
That's a fair point. I just want to finish off by talking about universities then. So where do you stand on that? Should a kid pay anything to go to university, or should it be free? And if it is, can we allow what Blair wanted, which was 50% of all children being able to get into university? What's your opinion on that?
Education's free up to 18. It should be free beyond 18 as well. We need the best skilled and educated young people, not only for the country's sake, but for their sake as well, to open as many horizons as possible. So education should be free. Now, I've been saying for a while, and apparently it's confirmed in this analysis elite manifesto, it would cost about £10 billion a year to do that. I mentioned early on the top 1,000 richest in the country worth £658 billion. That's 66 years of free university education just out of what 1,000 people have. So I think it's chicken feed, to be honest, to pay for free education, and we can do it for everybody. And by the way, not just everybody who's leaving school. I reckon university education through things like the Open University should be free and available to any adult who wants to go back and change their lives with education and so on. It should be education should be an absolute right.
Yeah, but it's all going to be paid for, and one of the ways it's going to pay for it is increasing taxes on people who earn more than £80,000 or £88,000. Now, you mentioned London before. There are people earning that kind of money, which isn't massive amounts if you're living in somewhere like London.
Well, it is still massive amounts, even in London, but what is different in London, obviously, are the costs of living in London. Things like house prices and even rents and so on, which is why I want Labour, and I think they're going to move in this direction, to start capping rents and start stopping private estate agents start charging huge fees to find people places to live and so on. But no, the real rich within society ought to be paying a fair share. The companies ought to be paying a fair share. Their taxes, where they pay them, because a lot of them are multinationals and get away without paying taxes, have been dropping over the last 10 or 20 years. Well, ordinary people's taxes, whether it's VAT or income tax or what have you, is a bigger proportion of their wages. So yes, the rich should pay more. Let's get back to a more equal society like we had 40-odd years ago.
And what do you think about this almost coronation of Theresa May? I mean, the newspapers, the BBC, I would even point to, well, particularly the BBC, it seems as if they're already giving her the crown. They're already saying it's a landslide. And every time Jeremy opens his mouth, he seems to be getting rubbished. I'm uncomfortable with it, even though I'm not a Corbyn supporter. I don't like what's going on at the moment. What do you feel as a Labour supporter?
Well, I think there's more than a grain of truth in the way that the media in general, and the BBC in particular, are reporting this election. A couple of nights ago, when Labour launched its election in Manchester, Newsnight that night started off by saying, well, the biggest general election news of the day was Labour launching its campaign in Manchester, but we're not going to do that. We're going to spend the next 20 minutes in Berwick-on-Tweed talking about whether it's a Tory or Labour marginal or not. And yes, there's this concentration of Theresa May, because the Tory party is still regarded as a nasty party by a lot of people, and they're trying to detoxify it a little bit by just talking about her and not the Tory party. We've got to remember, if the Tories get in on June the 8th, they've got plans for £22 billion worth of cuts in the health service. In our area of Coventry and Warwickshire, that's the closure of accident, emergency and maternity units in Nuneaton and in Warwick as well. They've got plans for £3 billion worth of cuts in schools. In my area, that's literally hundreds of teachers' jobs are at risk. This is not the nice Tories. This is still the nasty Tories, and we need to get rid of them on June the 8th.
Great talking to you, Dave. Thanks for taking the time today. That's Dave Nellist from the TUSC supporting Jeremy Corbyn. Thank you, Dave.
Get your kicks with Gaunty on Route 66 in association with Globemaster.